Hello and welcome to another episode of TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is Thursday, January 28th. Bit of snow out and about. Please be safe if you're out there. And hey, shovel your sidewalk. Other people are trying to walk by. We want them to be safe too. I want to just give you a quick hit of national, state, and local news, and then we'll cut right over to our interview with Brookline Historical Society President Ken Liss. We're going to talk about Florida, and that's going to be a great conversation. Pre-recorded, of course. But first, the news. Nationally, our Congressperson, Representative Jake Auchincloss, has called for the resignation or, if necessary, the expulsion of Congresswoman and QAnon conspiracy purveyor Marjorie Taylor Greene from the U.S. House of Representatives, stating, and I quote, "If you don't understand that calling for the murder of political rivals is a threat to democracy, you shouldn't be allowed to represent one." End quote. At the state level, Massachusetts vaccine deployment continues to be a disappointment. One recent news piece from the Globe reports that Harvard Associated Medical Centers provided early vaccines for graduate students and postdoctoral fellows far ahead of their approved order in the queue. Fenway Park will soon issue vaccines, but the website isn't especially helpful, and spots are filling up quickly. With no clearinghouse to allow for signups online and with no one number for older adults who have difficulties with the web, our seniors are really struggling with the system the DPH has developed. And right about now, House and Senate are voting on the climate change bill, again, made necessary by Governor Baker's veto. This news actually blends into local news because lines 314 through 316 of the bill, authored by yours truly, would allow Brookline to opt in to a net zero building code. These lines are a direct response to Brookline's warrant Article 21, which tried to do something very similar, but was rebuffed by Attorney General Maura Healey because Brookline's attempt ran afoul of state law. One more bit of local news. Tomorrow, you can tune in to Brookline Interactive Group right here to watch the ceremonial naming of the Florida Ruffin Ridley School, formerly the Coolidge Corner School, formerly the Edward Devotion School. And now, without further ado, we're going to cut right over to a conversation list to learn more about Florida Ruffin Ridley and her role in Brookline's history. Hello and welcome to today's interview on Brookline Interactive Group. We've got Ken Liss, the president of the Brookline Historical Society. We're not just going to yammer on about Brookline's history. We're going to focus on Florida Ruffin Ridley, who is a really important and somewhat hidden figure in Brookline, but who's very topical because, in fact, tomorrow at 3:30 right here on Brookline Interactive Group, you can watch the renaming ceremony where the school, formerly known as Coolidge Corner School, before that known as Edward Devotion School, will ceremoniously be renamed the Florida Ruffin Ridley School. So without further ado, Ken, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thanks, Tommy. Glad to be here.
Let's start by telling folks, sharing with folks a little bit about the Brookline Historical Society. Some viewers are familiar with it, but others may not be. What's the deal? What's the Brookline Historical Society all about?
Well, it's an old organization that's been around for 120 years. We are dedicated to telling stories about Brookline, encouraging people to be interested in Brookline's past and what we can learn from the past about the town that we all live, work, play in, etc.
And I imagine you've been involved in the Brookline Historical Society for some time. Some say you and the society have history. Tell us a little bit about your involvements in the Brookline Historical Society and you know how it is you came to be involved in this topic in the first place.
Yeah, I moved to Brookline with my family in 1996. I became interested in an old house around the corner from me and started doing some research around it, and did a presentation for the Historical Society and was invited to join the board, and then took over as president in 2009. So I've got a long-term presidency, and I'm always interested in finding stories, often stories that haven't been told. And the story of Florida Ruffin Ridley is one of those stories. It came about when I heard somebody say that Roland Hayes, the African-American singer who lived in Brookline for many years, was the first African-American to own property in Brookline. And I know that when people say something is the first or the oldest, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And I thought I'd try and find out. And as I did some research, I came upon this woman who I'd never heard of called Florida Ruffin Ridley, who with her husband Ulysses may have been the first to African-American to own property in Brookline. It's impossible to say for sure, but certainly it was 30 years before Roland Hayes.
And so for her and her husband to own property, this is when, the
1894. They
Yeah,
they bought their house, which still stands on Kent Street, on the east side of Kent Street, next to what were then the railroad tracks and now the D line.
And so to be able to purchase a house in 1894, it didn't take the kind of money it takes today, but not everybody was a homeowner. And so that suggests that she was already relatively established somehow. Tell us about maybe how she got to that point. What was she doing before 1894?
Well, she grew up in Boston. Her parents were both very prominent and active people. Her father, George Ruffin, was the first Black graduate of Harvard Law School, the first Black judge in Massachusetts, and a member of the Boston Common Council, which was a kind of a legislative body for the city of Boston before 1910. And her mother, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, was an activist who founded women's organizations and African-American civil rights organizations that her daughter became involved in. Florida married a man named Ulysses Ridley, who was a prominent tailor in Boston. And they were among the fairly well-to-do among Boston's African-American population.
And now Florida was a teacher. And I know that she was a teacher before she had children, and then she had a bit of a wiggle and a waggle. Tell us what happened at that point in her life.
Well, she attended a school called the Boston Normal School, later became Boston Teachers College, and graduated and became the second Black woman to teach in the Boston schools. And she kept that position until she married Ulysses Ridley in 1888. And although married men could still be teachers, married women could not. So she gave up her career at that time. She and her husband moved to Georgia, where he was originally from, for a few years, where they worked to develop kindergartens, and then came back to Boston, and in 1894 moved to Brookline.
And so they got to Brookline, and I know Florida was involved in an awful lot of things. When they got back to Brookline, was she again a teacher, or was she moving on to something else?
Yeah, she couldn't teach as a married woman, and she became involved with her mother in an organization that tried to promote Black women, and they started a newspaper called the Women's Era. Their organization was called the Women's Era Club. It was the first publication published, owned, and managed by Black women in the United States. And they really took on a lot of issues. And in 1895, a year after she moved to Brookline, they ran a national conference here in Boston. And I'm just going to read you a quote from Florida about the Women's Era Club that she and her mother were involved in. She said, "We, the women of the Women's Era Club, enter the field to work hand in hand with women, generally for humanity and humanity's interest. Not the Negro alone, but the Chinese, the Hawaiian, the Russian Jew, the oppressed everywhere are subjects for our consideration. Not the needs of the colored women, but women everywhere are our interests."
So I imagine that, not everyone was thrilled by her efforts. After all, if everyone was thrilled by her efforts, they probably wouldn't have been needed in the first place. Do you know of any pushback she received, either um, political, written, or more personal and physical? Do you know of any of those sorts of struggles she may have gone through?
Well, I think actually she was more the pusher than the pushy in a lot of ways, and that she pushed back against others. There was an incident, if you will, where a British woman who was working for women's rights and protecting women from abuse did not want to take on the issue of lynching. There was a sense that lynching was taking away from the issue. And she very aggressively wrote a response to this woman, pointing out that a lot of the fear of how lynching would take away, opposition to lynching or focus on lynching would take away from the women's rights movement was based on myths about Black men, and that almost buying into the idea that the men who were being lynched were guilty, and she really fought back against that. So she really did a lot to push and make sure that voices that weren't always heard were heard in new ways.
And it sounds like she's at what turns out to be a really interesting intersection, and that is the intersection of women's suffrage and voting for people of color. And I know there was tremendous tension. There were many suffragettes who were focused on women receiving the right to vote and were afraid if that included Black women, it would make it more difficult to make the incremental progress they were going for, whereas others took the position that right is right and we need to fight for all. And I imagine it certainly sounds like she would have taken the latter position if it were put to her quite that directly. Was she involved, do you know, with suffrage movements directly? And what was her role? How did that play out?
She most definitely was. She was a member of a suffrage organization in Brookline, and suffrage was very controversial in Brookline. There were very strong opinions, as there always are in Brookline, on both sides of the suffrage question. And she advocated for it. She also, women could vote in Brookline before 1920 in school board elections. And it's interesting, I'm not sure what the first year was that they could vote, but there's an article in I can't remember if it was in the Globe or in the local paper about in 1902 about women lining up to vote for the school board. And the only woman who's mentioned by name is Florida Ruffin Ridley. So she was out there making sure. There's also another wonderful quote from her in 1897 about suffrage, where she said that no group of men should have the power to say who should not exercise the rights of freedom. The suffrage question is like so many other questions, no question at all if faced in its nakedness. So I don't know where she came down on whether suffrage should be universal and including people of all color. But she certainly, everything I know about her, that's certainly what she would have believed in.
So that's remarkable, right? She's involved in quite a few different places where she did things herself that were remarkable, but also used her time and her effort to push for progress for entire groups of people within Brookline and beyond. And so we talked about suffrage. We certainly talked about her being perhaps the first homeowner. Her work with the newspaper. Uh, there's more though, right? What else is there to know?
Well, in preparing to talk to you, I research never ends and always finding new things. And I found some new things today. And one of the things that really impressed me about her is I knew how dedicated she was, how fierce an advocate she was for the causes that she fought for. Something that I kind of knew, but never really sunk in until I started looking at a lot of things today, is how efficient and effective and organized she was. Is that when she took up a cause, it wasn't just passion that she brought to it. She brought power, she brought organization, she knew how to work for change. And I've been really impressed by that. And it came up in so many things. It came up in her work for suffrage. It came up in her work against lynching. It came up in the work with her mother to found National Black Women's Organizations. The organization part of it was an important part to both of them. That they knew that it wasn't just a matter of believing in something and fighting for it. You had to be organized, and you had to organize others. And I think that's something that has really impressed me. And I keep finding new ways that she did it. During World War I, she worked to develop support for Black soldiers who were not getting the same kind of support that white soldiers were getting. And again, she just kind of put herself into it and brought people together to make things happen. While she was doing this, while she was working on all of these things, she was also a co-founder of the Second Unitarian Church in Brookline, which kind of broke off from the first parish, which was as the population grew. But she also found time to write. She wrote a lot about the causes that she believed in, but she also wrote short stories. And in fact, she and Dorothy West, another famous Black writer, were members of something called the Saturday Evening Quill Club in Boston in the 1920s. They published a journal, and it was sort of like Boston's own little Harlem Renaissance for the magazine that published stories by both of them and others. So she really put so much into pretty much everything that she did. She was also interested in history. She helped found an organization called the Society of Descendants of Early American Negroes. She wrote something called The Other Bostonians, about the history of Black Bostonians. And I think about Black Lives Matter, and we think about Black Lives Matter as being focused on police and just the value of Black lives. But I would say in a sense that I think that she thought also that Black history matters. And that while she was fighting for the future and the present of African Americans in Boston and in the country, she was also fighting for the importance of their past. And I think that's, as someone who's so interested in history, that really impressed me too, that she really saw the whole picture, and that how all of these things were tied together, that the way we tell the story of the past affects our present and our future. And she clearly saw that and really worked for it. And that's really impressive to me.
Do you think that the greater Brookline community, and by that I mean the white people who lived in Brookline at her time, appreciated her and her efforts, were sort of oblivious to her and her efforts, were frustrated by her? How do you think that the community around her felt about what she was up to?
Well, it's hard to say. We don't have a lot of direct evidence of how she was received, but she was integrated, if you will, into society. I think she was in a sense, the fact that that 1902 article about women voting for the school committee, she's the only one mentioned. She was recognized. People knew who she was. She was involved when she was involved in the Suffrage Association. That was a mixed race organization, and just knowing the limited population of African Americans in Brookline at the time, it was mostly a white organization, and so she was involved with that. And I think the fact from that quote earlier that she talked about not only being interested in Black women, but in women of all kinds. And she mentions a Russian Jew. She mentions Hawaiians, which is kind of interesting. But this was in, I think that quote was from 1897, and the United States had recently taken over Hawaii, which had been an independent kingdom. Actually, the last queen of Hawaii actually moved to Brookline for a brief time. So she was aware of other people and their causes. And I can't help but think that that helped her be accepted and recognized as someone who just was worthy of consideration for what she did, and who she was, and not, or despite the color of her skin.
And so we've just got a few minutes left. If it's all right with you, I'd like to circle back to the renaming of the Coolidge Corner School, previously named the Edward Devotion School. Before her name was floated as one possibility, I had never heard of her. I suspect many people in Brookline had never heard of her. Frankly, I think many people in Brookline still haven't heard of her. And so do you have any sense for sort of how her name ended up on a shorter list, right? Who was the person who said, "Hey, I got a story about a person you might like," and how did that person know about Florida?
Well, I think I might be that person, because after having learned about her while researching who the first Black property owners in Brookline might be, we being the Historical Society, had a booth at Brookline Day at Lars Anderson Park in 2018. And we put together 6 or 8 posters of Brookline people who people might not have heard about, or might have heard about but didn't know that there was a Brookline connection. And she was one of them. And we had that poster hanging from our booth, and the folks who were there looking for nominees for a new name for the school saw the poster, asked if they could borrow it and bring it over to their table, and they did. And I believe that's how the name got into contention for a renaming of the school. It might have come up otherwise, but she was, Barbara Brown from Hidden Brookline. Hidden Brookline does a lot to look at the hidden history of slavery in Brookline and bring it to light. But there are other parts of Brookline's history, especially its history of African Americans in Brookline, that are hidden even beyond slavery. And she was kind of hidden. I don't know if she would have been discovered if I hadn't kind of stumbled upon her and put that poster together. So I can't say for certain that that's how it happened, but I like to think that it did, and I'm very pleased and proud that she's been the name that's been chosen for the school.
There's quite a bit of poetry there. There's the maybe more direct or more obvious poetry of changing the name of a school from a former slave owner to someone who fought to expand rights and privileges to lots of different people, women, people of color, even Hawaiians, as it were. But there's also another bit of poetry, and that is that someone who cared enough about the history of people of color was rediscovered by someone who cares so much about the history of Brookline And now, by the community putting her name on the school, helps all of us to rediscover some of that very history that Florida uh, was so intent on us remembering. And so that there's a little poetry there. And this is all new to me. These are not set up questions. I'm learning with you at home, right? I mean, this is what's so fun about the show. Uh, Listen, Ken, thank you so much for your time. I know you love to do this historical work, and I know you love to teach. For those who don't know, Ken gives historical walks in different neighborhoods throughout the town. I don't know if you're still doing it sort of from a distance in COVID, or if we've got to wait another few months. I've been on several of them. If you're into architecture, it's fascinating. If you're into understanding how the architecture ties in with the rest of history, it's also interesting. The fact of the matter is, it's easy to walk around and point at old buildings because they're still here. And so some of the tours really sort of center, at least rely on that architecture. But so Ken, you're a wonderful asset for Brookline. The Brookline Historical Society is phenomenal, and I know quietly goes about doing the great work that it does. I hope folks will find your website, and I hope that as we come out of COVID and as the weather gets better, people will take the opportunity to transition from reading the blog posts and reading online to getting outside of their home and sort of seeing in person and breathing in that history. So Ken, thanks for everything you do. Viewers, you've been watching Brookline Interactive Group, TV on TV, and we hope that you will tune in tomorrow at 3:30 for the live ceremony to rename the school, the Florida Ruffin Ridley School. And you can do that by watching just as you are now, either online or on your television, Brookline Interactive Group. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.